We'll talk briefly about how we think interagency partnerships can benefit culture and, more importantly, all of New Yorkers. And then we'll open it up to you and to this little game that we're going to play. I'm going to introduce Randy Borscheit. Randy you're the President Emeritus of Alliance for the Arts. Randy was the Deputy Commissioner of Cultural Affairs under Dinkins and is an incredible cultural advocate. And under Koch, sorry, Koch. Oh my goodness, I was not going back far enough, sorry. Koch. It wasn't Abe Lincoln, I know that. So I'm just going to have Randy say hello. And Randy, if you could just tell us what agency you think is the most prime for DCA to have a partnership with.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. DCA is Department of Cultural Affairs. You probably all know that. And has a history of working with a number of sister city agencies. Some of these connections are easy and obvious, like the Parks Department, when the agency is funding things like Shakespeare in the Park and summer concerts in the parks and things like that. That's an original and easy one. But there's a wonderful history of partnerships between cultural affairs and the Department of Education. One thing that I take a lot of pleasure in knowing is that the mayor-elect, when he was running for office all the way back to the primary, made a big point about calling for increases in arts education programs. He had a very clear statement that every public school child in New York ought to have access to good arts education programs. I believe in that. I know a lot of people do. There's, as I say, a history of cultural affairs working with the education department. It'd be interesting to see if those partnerships could be built on and increased. Another interesting connection was with the Department for the Aging. It's well known that the population in New York City is aging in the sense that the percentage of seniors is increasing. These are people who, in many cases, spread out throughout the city, in every neighborhood, every community, are prime audience members. They're often there already, but in many cases, they have impediments to overcome. Those impediments are transportation or location. They may not be living near places that they would like to visit and participate in programs. Or, of course, they have financial issues. And the Cultural Affairs Department, I know, has been working very closely with aging to increase access for seniors. Again, I think that's an extremely important thing. I could go on and talk about economic development and economic development corporation, for example, and a number of other agencies, but I probably should not take any more time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Randy. And I'm going to introduce our second moderator for the day, and that's Jennifer Wright-Cook, who's the Executive Director of the Field. I invited Jennifer specifically because I think she has a perspective on the role of the individual artist. And I'd love to ask you to come up and say hello and tell us what department DCA could partner with to best support the needs of the individual artist.
Thanks, I'm happy to be here today, and nice turnout for this day. So on the individual artist front, what I'm most interested in, and I think where we have an opportunity is pretty obvious, but complicated at the same time, which is obviously with housing. And I honestly don't know if it's HUD or HPD in terms of housing development, but housing and sort of our public spaces are such a visible opportunity for people who don't have access to the arts in a professional sense or in a financial way to see what's possible just from the pure, most basic creative standpoint, not necessarily about being a professional artist. And I feel like our housing, both the mural projects, the streets landscape, all the conference and rec rooms inside housing developments are just a great opportunity for kids, particularly, to have access to early skill building in the arts, and that there are individual artists all over the city who would welcome the opportunity to work with kids and adults in all sorts of mural projects and housing projects to build their skills and to give back to their community and to make a livable wage from their work. Whether that's music or painting or dance or drama, there are just many opportunities and many individual artists I think would jump at that chance. So that's that.
Excellent. And now for the interactive portion of our event. You all have cards. These cards, if you don't have cards, you should come up and get one of each color. Your cards are going to have an art form. These are, I only put 10 art forms because that's what we were printing these. So if you want to make your art form more specific, for example, I have dance, you could say it was ballet if you would like to. A department in the New York City government, and a borough of New York City. And so the challenge with these is to come up with a way that DCA can work with this agency, Department of Cultural Affairs can work with the agency that's on your card to flourish this particular art form or bring it to a community that it's not already in this borough. And everybody can take their cards, and you are welcome to either throw that up as a challenge to one of us or to come up and tell us your idea for how that could happen. So we need a brave volunteer to go first.
So I read the cards off. All right, so I have the Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development. And my art medium is performance, and my borough is Brooklyn. So when I think of housing, preservation, and development, I think of spaces. When I think of performance, I think of spaces. When I think of Brooklyn, I think of cool. So I think that there's there's a lot of possibilities there, especially to bring, I think of an organization like No Longer Empty that's looking to highlight, spaces that are maybe forgotten, maybe that could use a new status of some sort, and to enlighten that space with performance by bringing artists into it, by bringing the community there, bringing the press there, and fixing it up in some way. I mean, the other day we were talking. We did this breakout session on Tuesday where we played a game with Art and Democracy Project, and we imagined how we can make Brownsville more safer, really, through the arts. And we thought about how we could kind of bring in different arts projects to different spaces to keep the businesses open later. And I just feel like there's kind of a synergy there. So, I'm Jason Moss, the founder and director of the Artist Volunteer Center.
Thank you, Jason. Somebody who wants to go next? Jonathan, you look like you want to go.
I'm Jonathan Slaff. I'm a theatrical press agent. And I was also the lead author on the 2002 study on the economic impact of the 9/11 attacks on artists of all disciplines in New York City. So I have the sanitation department and opera and Manhattan. Well, the answer is easy. Does anyone remember the newspaper trucks, like the Daily News trucks that would carry a sign on the side that had that day's edition of the Daily News blown up to truck size, and it would promote the Daily News? Well, the sanitation trucks are all over the city, so they should be emblazoned with replaceable signs you can drop in, announcing what operas are playing. And as they circulate through Manhattan, they will develop audience for these operas.
Wonderful. You know that the city of Philadelphia actually has all their sanitation trucks painted. I think they're pink for breast cancer awareness. So you see all these pink sanitation trucks everywhere, and it's rather cheerful. So any next Next victim who wants to come up before I start calling on people? Just run up. Just like, Karen, you want to? Here, have my. Oh, you're just observing. Okay, I'm going to do one, and somebody else think, okay, it's coming. I have probably an easy one because it's already going on. I have dance and the Parks and Recreation and Manhattan. Well, Fall for Dance was lovely at the Delacorte Theater this summer in Central Park, but there certainly could be more room to have dance performance that maybe was out in the live natural space of Central Park. And Fall for Dance with the leaves falling would be a great time to incorporate that and maybe, use the Great Lawn or somewhere as well as the stage. Maybe it's even a way to do something during the day and then have a presentation. Or a dance for the Shakespeare in the Park line. Very fun too. All right. Bearing in mind that, as in any kind of brainstorming, there are no bad ideas, right? We all have ideas. I'm Karen Lighting with the Arts and Business Council of New York. My borough is Staten Island. My agency is Homo Services, and my art form is theater. And this makes me think of the great work that Free Arts NYC is doing. You're familiar with that. They work with children who are underserved, often in homeless shelters, and they go in and do day-long workshops that involve the business community to come in and partner with the kids to create art. Wouldn't it be great if in Staten Island, and let's bring another agency in too, let's say housing, that they could go into a space and invite members of the business community to come in and work with people either from shelters or who are involved with that agency to create and perform theater of their own. The same way Manhattan Theater Club works with high school students in Rikers Island to help them write plays, short plays about their experience, but to help them channel their emotions and artistic impulses into something that can be theater. That would be actually kind of easy, and I really like that. Building on models that exist. That didn't sound like a crazy idea as you teed it up to me. All right, who wants to pop up next? Randy, do you want to do yours? Yes.
Well, transportation, Brooklyn, and new media. First of all, as everyone knows, new media and Brooklyn are synonymous. So what could I imagine that isn't already going on here? But, it'd be fun to extend the reach of new media. I think if you're 16, you're really comfortable with it and in it. It'd be fun to use the bus system and the subway system going in and to and from and through Brooklyn to introduce writers to the idea of location finding and information providing app that works in the subway. We know that apps work in the subway in some spots now. But you can play around with that idea and let artists imagine what kind of message they would like to convey to everyday passengers on buses and subways about what they're doing, what their friends are doing, what their favorite cultural projects are in the borough, and invite people and tie that to location information. So, you're on the Amtrak or whatever. What are you passing here? And the next time you come by here, get off at Smith and Nice, you could walk a few blocks and have your life changed by seeing or hearing or experiencing something really wonderful. And learn a little bit more about the media.
Excellent. I'm always thinking when I'm in the subway, when I see those QR codes, is who has perception down here? We should have more of them on the buses. But some places on the subway we do. So, but excellent. I love hearing that.
So I got really lucky. I got the Bronx Park and Rec and painting. So it makes me think about all the 5-point stuff right now. So it makes me think then about building on models, like I think Karen said, and maybe connecting the Bronx Museum and the Park and Rec, or the galleries in the Bronx and the Park and Rec, and connecting kids and kids making to spaces that maybe they feel like they can't inhabit, where the more, quote unquote fancy art is. And so maybe the Bronx Museum connects to the Park and Rec and the galleries, and they have a combo exhibit that starts in the park, and the kids are given an opportunity to make stuff and draw stuff and given all these supplies, and then they're taken into the museums and the galleries and walk through what's there, and how that connects to what they just made. So they're really enlivened by the process and not feeling intimidated by quote unquote professional art. So that's my idea. Can I say one other thing, which is from the individual artist standpoint? I talked to some of my colleagues before coming here today, and one of the biggest challenges for them in terms of dealing with the DCA or in other intergovernmental agencies is obviously the paperwork. And they just don't have the time or the energy or the energy to grapple with the politicking and the paperwork and the things that you need just to get your foot in the door there. And there's an amazing project called the American Slavery Project that was working with the burial grounds in the World Trade Center, and they were working on a show that gathered all the data of all the grave sites and then enlivening the space with the stories of those people. And they were working with the New York Historical Society, who was incredibly welcoming and supportive of the project. And they were trying to get a live performance in the park downtown. It's a national park, and eventually they just felt so put off by the process and so not helped that they gave up. And that broke my heart, because I think it's an amazing use of that, those stories and the history of our city in that way, and that they just couldn't grapple with the bureaucracy and the governance of that. So I feel like for individual artists to work better with the system, the government has to start paying different processes in order for them to get their foot in the door.
Great point. So if you want to add in as you're bringing up the cards and how DCA can help facilitate some of these partnerships that we're talking about for these ideas, I think helping with the paperwork. Is there somebody in the office who that's their dedicated role, provided they have the funding for it? Put it on, find an entity to help people through the paperwork process to work with these agencies. Let's jump up.
Sure. My name is Doug Israel. I'm with the Center for Arts Education, and I got Staten Island Parks and Rec and Interactive. It's definitely not kind of my area of expertise, but just thinking about so many of the great street artists and performers that we have in New York City, especially when you take a stroll through, let's say, Central Park on a Saturday afternoon in the summer, you're likely to see so many great kind of pop-up art things happening. But if we had a week of interactive arts happening at our parks throughout the city, where you actually tap some of those performers and some of those street artists and ask them to kind of create some sort of interactive experience where you're sitting on a blanket on a Saturday afternoon in your favorite park, and all of a sudden something's happening around you and you're invited to participate, whether it be in some sort of weird kind of theater experience or some kind of drumming or some kind of visual art experience, or even juggling or whatever it may be. It's like some way for to engage tourists and people having a casual afternoon in the arts throughout all 5 boroughs, but we can start on Staten Island with some of their great parks.
Wonderful. Come on up.
Okay. I'm Tim Schreier. I'm with the One Day on Earth Foundation. The reason I say I think back into the trifecta here is we're doing a 10-series exploration of infrastructure, both physical and social, as it pertains to access to opportunity in New York is one of our focus areas. But I hit Queens, I hit environmental, and I hit video. Two things come to mind. Newtown Creek, and I think that there's plenty of narratives that can come out of that. And the whole revamping of the Newtown Creek and and the challenges that lie ahead, and also the Queensland and the way it's supposed to wind into different communities and different immigrant communities and recent immigrants. There certainly is a collection of narratives there.
All right, who else wants to run up? Run up.
Hey folks, I'm Casey Boyle with the Musicians Union. I have an interesting trio of Department of Transportation, Projection, and Queens. And at first thought, I thought this was going to be a bit challenging, but yesterday I had the illustrious meeting with folks over at Rooftop Films, and I think that this situation would be perfectly applied to an organization whose sole purpose is to try and serve underserved communities, especially in the outer boroughs, such as Queens. So two things that come to mind. One would be to help them provide greater access to pedestrian plazas, to either host film locations for festivals, or to that end, also use pedestrian plazas for projection that might be part of an installation piece for particular artists. And two, again, someone spoke to this earlier, just helping good organizations like Rooftop Films and other like-minded organizations streamline the bureaucratic process to help sift through that paperwork and get the job done. So that's it.
Next, run up. And remember, if you want to tweet, the hashtag is Interagency.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Laura Ritter. I'm the former chair of Community Board 12 Manhattan's Parks and Cultural Affairs Committee. So I was not immediately prepared to talk about the Bronx dance and police. The police not being typically one of the agencies that I associate with the arts. But I got what I got. There is a significant West African community in and around Claremont Park in the Bronx. They frequently have festivals, drumming events, events such as that. I think there's a fine line between what some people will call art and what some people will call a disturbance. So working with the police on figuring out how a community defines art versus disturbance and how the police can be a part of a community conversation about how to distinguish those two and actually marry those two, I think is useful. The Bronx has a number of really interesting open spaces for dance. There's all of the Grand Concourse. How cool would that be? Incorporating the Grand Concourse into a performance art space from, Marshall Parkway to the Poe House and down beyond. There's a lot of potential there. There's also Bronx Community College. There's Post Coast Community College, which has a strong relationship with Kinney and the Heights and Washington Heights. There are many ties between those communities owing to the large Dominican population in both of those communities. So I think that there's a lot of potential for dance and open spaces and integrating arts and education institutions in both boroughs. And I think that working with the police to get them a little outside of their comfort zone of law enforcement to see what else it is that communities do, how they perceive quality of life, why it's fair to define something not as graffiti but as art, and why it's sometimes fair to define something not as art but as graffiti. Working with who are the artists, who are the taggers, who are the property owners, and what's the community's collective investment in those spaces, I think is a really important conversation to have, and I think the police should be a part of it, not on the sidelines.
Hi, I'm Lori Sherman, also with the Center for Arts Education, and I have dance, Queens, and environmental protection. I'm about education, and I know what the artists can do in terms of top ladder, collaboration, and critical thinking, and all those things. I'm thinking we could park dancers into schools with staff from the DOE, create dances that kind of explore what environmental issues and problems are throughout Queens or all of the boroughs, and then have those dances publicly performed so people start to become more aware. So you're using dance to build awareness of environmental issues, you're informing students, families, and members of the community, as well as people who are working in the agency.
Lovely. Who hasn't gone?
Hello, I'm Eric Pryor. I'm also with the Center for Arts Education. I have the Bronx Projection and Housing Preservation and Development. I'd love to get projection artists together with kids with the Center for Arts Education, so that makes sense to me. They could be from housing or they could be from DOE schools. Put them together with projection artists and then we go project. They create their own work and we project them in spaces that are run by the Housing Preservation and Development. And I would imagine they're historic sites that could use some projection on them that would make them more interesting and create dialogue around their work and have conversations around meaning and how they came up with their concepts. Thank you.
You want to come up? I know you do.
Good morning, I'm Anthony Myers, Associate Director of the Bronx Council on the Arts. Most of you have talked about the Bronx already, so I guess I don't need to. But part of what I'm going to say is inspired by it. I have art form painting, agency transportation, and borough Queens. Of course, there's the conversations around 5 points, but I'm also connecting it to something someone said about the rooftop films, and I've actually worked with rooftop films in the Bronx, at the Bronx Terminal Market. And I think it's just my wish is to continue the work in finding non-traditional locations that those in transportation venues can view. I've been on the Bruckner Expressway, and there was a graffiti artist that did a work, I am a human being, on the side of a building, and I could see it off of the highway. It's sort of not a traditional venue to sort of create art pieces for people to view, but I think it's the most interesting. I think it connects to being on the 7 train and seeing the 5 points work, and I think maybe working between transportation and other agencies to look at more non-traditional venues where people can view potentially art and create more work and connect with some of the more sort of authentic types of art like graffiti and others that are really important to the city of New York. So, thank you.
Yes, sure. You're welcome to. Come on up.
I love all these ideas. This is great. In our work at the Arts and Business Council, connecting the arts and business communities, one of our mantras is we're always thinking of what's the benefit to business. And I would just encourage us all as we're thinking about interagency collaborations, of course our focus is on what's the benefit to the arts. How can we use buildings that aren't being used? How can we use the resources? But I think we'll do a lot better for ourselves if we think about what's the benefit to the agency and prevent it that way, because we're having terrific success with that business community. So let's expand that too.
Yes, Kate wanted to do one, and who else hasn't come up? All right. Yeah, Kate, you want to do one?
I have nothing really valuable to contribute to this. Seriously, I've got nothing. Art form, opera, borough, Manhattan, agency, police. I don't know. Mario Alonso was a truck driver who became an opera singer. Maybe we can encourage more police to do that. I don't know. No, I don't know. I know that opera is an art form that is really considered connected to a certain demographic of the city, and perhaps there's some way that police community affairs can get involved in presenting opera in areas that are not engaged as much. In underserved areas of Manhattan, there are some, as we know, as opposed to other boroughs. Anybody have any ideas? I don't know. up one. Have the police cars and roam the neighborhoods and have opera coming out, marching bands, street, yeah, simulcast street. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Street performance.
Sirens, opera.
Yeah. Sirens opera. That's good. More police sirens and opera.
More police sirens and opera. Okay, that's a great one. Wonderful. If anyone wants to do a second one, we can do that. Is anyone not gone who really wants to go, burning desire to go? Okay.
Actually,
Yeah.
there's an organization in East Harlem. What was loud?
There's a lot of street noise.
There's an organization, and I'm trying to remember the name. It's like Música de la Cámara or something. It's organized by an opera singer, Puerto Rican opera singer named Eva de la O, I think. And they actually work with a lot of youth of color and producing classical music. And so when I think of what the topics are just now, more programs that expose disenfranchised communities to sort of the established classical art forms to expand their horizon. Those who have, maybe children of those that have been in the criminal system or something. So it's just the thought.
I know that one of the folks we wanted to potentially be a moderator as well is a woman named Kemi Alessini who runs the Laundromat Project. And I don't know if they're working specifically with interagency contracts right now, but they do amazing work in laundromats with artists and public art projects and visual arts, and then they enliven the neighborhoods around them as well. And they're working in Bed-Stuy, I think, and Brownsville maybe. And it's just, it's kids and it's local folks and it's the artists connecting around art in their public spaces and laundromats. So to the point about arts and business, like, who knows, small business administration, or the big groups bringing in artists into those spaces where people really live and work. And so enlivening those spaces that way with visual art, awesome.
Awesome. Nobody ended up pulling the agency, the corrections card, but we do know that our friends at the Public Theater are doing some wonderful work, bringing theater, and they just brought Much Ado About Nothing with great success into Rikers and doing more corrections from that. Just thinking of that, jumping off your comment on police, so that's another agency that we know Culture is already partnering with, and maybe can do more. They're wonderful. So I just want to bring our moderators back up and talk a little bit about these ideas, and if we had any new ones out of this, or how we can make these partnerships easier.
Well, I think having a conversation with the new mayor when he is in office, and with the new members of the city council, obviously there with the social affairs committee, but with other committees that would be interested in the same kind of interagency collaborations that we've been talking about. So there would be both leadership from the mayor's office and possibility of funding. Because sooner or later, most of these programs that we're talking about require a little money. They're not big, expensive ideas, but they require both commitment and some funding from the government. I think the Cultural Affairs Department could take the lead in reaching out to the various agencies and exploring potential partnerships or the expansion of partnerships that they're already working on, and take those ideas to the mayor, to the leaders of the council, and so forth. I think I think we're at a moment where we can begin to give a voice to the people of New York. last count about 8.3 million of us. And I'd like to sort of play a different kind of game, a serious governmental game in which we assume that every one of those 8.3 million people is potentially an artist. They're certainly all potentially audience members, participants in that sense. If we could encourage them to come up with programs, ideally starting with the youngest kids. So this is an idea that people grow up with. But I think you could equally well reach out to people at any age and say, get back to your cultural roots in any sense that you choose to understand that, going back to your music or art class in elementary school, or back to the culture that you left behind when you were an immigrant or somebody who moved here from any distant place. And see how you can express not only yourself in artistic form, but a cultural tradition that is meaningful to you, or a cultural tradition that you're determined to invent fresh, new.
Jennifer, do you want to maybe talk about how artists might work with DCA and some of these agencies and how that might create some models for other interagency partnerships in government?
I'll give it a shot. Well, I think some of my primary takeaways are what Karen from Arts and Business said about understanding how we're going to help the agency. Because I'm sure they are understaffed, under-resourced themselves, so we have to make it easy for them to say yes to us. So I feel like one possibility is that the DCA, maybe in partnership with different art service organizations, could host a open table meeting of all the different agencies and some sort of liaison staff person to just share what they're working on, what they hope to work on, and just sort of a brainstorming talk to it face to face and really meet the people who are in the agencies to talk about their processes. And then maybe the service organizations can work with the DCA and the different agencies to figure out the processes, the paperwork, the permits, to figure out how to make it easier for folks to apply and to get the projects going. So I feel like there's getting to yes, which is just so key, but really opening yourself up to, this is a partnership, and we're not just imposing our values on what you're doing, but what are we going to learn from you as well in that process. So I think that's one of my biggest takeaways, and I feel like there are many service organizations in all of our boroughs that can also bear responsibility for moving that process forward, and the transparency around the processes that we can take on. Yeah.
So I've been to a bunch of culture talks here at the Talking Transition tent, and a key word that kept coming. One asked us what was the first word that came to mind when we thought of artists or art, and I don't know if it's to be different or encapsulated in one word. One of the ones that came up for me was innovation. So I wonder how our artists and our cultural organizations can help form these interagency partnerships by the creative thinking that we all possess, and by being innovators, and by going into some of these meetings and saying, well, we would love you to help us by helping us get through this permit process to do something in the park, but here's a way that we think maybe you can make this easier or more accessible, or here's some of our creative ideas for that, and bringing some of these kind of brainstorming things that are happening all throughout Talking Transition and in this room and in a lot of the meetings that I know all of us are having and events that we're going to, and try to help sort of bring that creative perspective, creative problem solving into government, and how we can be a partner with that. And I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of how things can be more open, and how there can be more openness, more transparency, and more public participation in government. And I think that's something that we're hearing again throughout the talks here at Talking Transition. And I know it was one of the key words when many of us were at the City Council hearing on the cultural plan on Tuesday. I know interagency was a key word that came up, but I know that one of the other key words that came up was transparency, and perhaps those two things are coming together.
So So I think local communities typically know their communities better than a centralized agency. Even if the agency is extremely well-informed and well-intentioned, the people in neighborhoods are, not surprisingly, going to know their neighborhoods better. So on the community board, when we would get presentations from artists and from DCA or DOT or Department of Parks about installations in green streets, in malls, in parks, sometimes this was great stuff that people really liked, and people had some technical questions about insurance and how are people going to keep it safe. That's where the police come in. They have a serious role in public art. But sometimes we as a board would look at this art and say, you know, who are these people? This is nice, but why here? This has nothing to do with us. This doesn't make sense in this place. This doesn't relate to the architecture. This doesn't relate to the way people actually use the space. So it seems to me that there really needs to be some kind of process for DOT. Parks is actually much better at this than most of the other agencies, but for Parks, DOT, and DCA to have as part of their process talking with community boards. I don't know if CB12 Manhattan is unusual or usual in that it has a committee that is dedicated specifically in part to cultural affairs. And we have that committee linked to parks because so much of what's happening in northern Manhattan in terms of cultural affairs is happening in, around, through, and in partnership with parks. But that seems like a good model to be used in other boroughs. The other thing that we have in northern Manhattan is something called the Northern Manhattan Arts Alliance, and it has been the sponsoring agency for the last 6 years on something called the Uptown Art Stroll, which is an event we started 11 years ago, and it works in partnership with businesses. And people say, well, what's in it for the business? What's in it for the business is artists partner with mostly bars